she walked into the water and let them find her. Every morning, before the doctor could treat a patient in 18th century Europe, someone had to collect the leeches. And the way they were collected was exactly as simple and as strange as it sounds. A woman walked into the water. She stood still. She waited for the leeches to attach themselves to her bare legs. And then she reached down and removed them one by one, dropped them into a jar, and moved to the next patch of water. This was how it worked. This was the entire method. Her legs were the bait, the collection tool, and the productivity measure all at once. No apparatus, no equipment, no protection of any kind. Just her, the water, and whatever lived in it. This is the story of the leech collectors, the women who supplied the medical establishment of an entire continent with the one thing it couldn't function without, and what the work did to them over time. And by the end of this video, you will understand why nobody stopped to ask whether there might be a better way. The supply was there, the price was right. That was enough. To understand why this job existed, you have to understand what leeches meant to medicine in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was not fringe practice. This was mainstream medical treatment, endorsed by the most respected physicians in Europe, taught in medical schools, and applied to patients across every class and condition. The theory behind it was ancient. The body, doctors believed, contained four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and illness resulted from an imbalance among them. Too much blood in a particular area of the body caused inflammation, fever, and pain. The solution was to remove that excess blood. Leeches were the most precise and controllable tool available for this purpose. A skilled physician could place them exactly where the blood was believed to be excessive, allow them to feed to saturation, then remove them when enough blood had been drawn. They were used for headaches, skin conditions, inflammation of any kind, eye complaints, liver disorders, reproductive conditions in women, and a vast range of other diagnoses. Hospitals maintained standing orders with suppliers. Pharmacies kept jars of them behind the counter as a standard stock item. Physicians sent prescriptions for them as routinely as they prescribed anything else. Demand was enormous, consistent, and growing across the entire 19th century. As medical practice expanded, and the theory of bloodletting remained dominant for far longer than it deserved to. In France alone, millions of leeches were used annually by the 1820s. Britain imported tens of millions per year at the peak of demand. The supply required to meet this need was staggering, and it all came from people standing in marshes. The leech collector operated at the very base of this supply chain, as essential to the medical system as the physician at the top of it, compensated as if she were barely part of it at all. She typically sold to a local pharmacy or directly to a physician's household, receiving a fixed price per leech that had not significantly changed in decades, despite rising demand. The economics worked against her from every direction. The more leeches the system needed, the more time she spent in the water. The more time she spent in the water, the more her body absorbed what the work demanded. And the price per leech stayed flat, regardless of what the work cost her. Nobody in the chain above her was tracking what the collection process did to a human body over time. They were tracking supply and price. That was the entire scope of their concern. Now here is what the daily reality of this work actually did to the body of the person doing it. A leech bite is not like a puncture from a needle or a thorn. The leech releases a cocktail of biochemical compounds when it feeds, an anesthetic, so the host doesn't feel the initial attachment, an anticoagulant that prevents the blood from clotting, ensuring it flows freely for the duration of the feeding, and a vasodilator that actively widens the blood vessel to increase flow. These compounds don't simply stop working the moment the leech is removed. A leech bite continues to bleed actively for hours afterward, sometimes longer, because the anticoagulant remains in the tissue. A single bite from a medicinal leech can result in the loss of 5 to 10 times the amount of blood the leech itself consumed. For a woman whose work involved dozens of leech attachments per day, in multiple sessions across a working week, the cumulative blood loss was significant. Over months, this produced measurable anemia, fatigue, weakness, reduced cold tolerance, which was particularly punishing given that the work required standing in cold marsh water in all but the warmest months. Some accounts describe leech collectors developing infections at bite sites, because the same water that attracted leeches also carried bacteria, and broken skin in a marsh environment was an open invitation. There were no medical consultations about occupational health, no regulations governing how many hours a collector could work or how many bites she should sustain per day. The market set the pace. She needed the income. She went into the water until she had enough. Then she went home, bandaged what was still bleeding, and came back the next morning. There's a detail in William Wordsworth's poem, The Leech Gatherer, written in 1802, that captures this reality more precisely than any official record does. He describes an old man he encountered, bent, weathered, and solitary, wading in a pond, and collecting leeches with the resigned patience of someone for whom suffering had simply become the background condition of work. Wordsworth wrote the poem as a meditation on persistence in the face of hardship. He did not write it as a critique of the system that had made the old man's persistence necessary. Nobody did. The leech collector's endurance was noted, sometimes even admired. The question of whether her endurance should have been required at all was never seriously asked by anyone in a position to change the answer. But the most revealing part of this story isn't what the work did to her body. It's what happened to the leech supply when collectors could no longer keep up with demand, and what the medical establishment decided to do about that problem, instead of fixing the one it had already created. Here is what happened when the supply of leeches finally began to collapse. By the middle of the 19th century, wild leech populations across Europe were in serious decline. The cause was not difficult to identify. Decades of intensive collection had removed leeches from marshes and ponds faster than natural reproduction could replace them. The wetlands themselves were also being drained for agriculture and development, eliminating the habitat entirely in many regions. The medical establishment, confronted with a shortage of a tool it had built its entire treatment philosophy around, responded with a set of solutions that revealed exactly where its priorities sat. It began importing leeches from further afield. Hungary, Sweden, and eventually North Africa became major suppliers, with leeches shipped in damp moss across significant distances to reach European pharmacies still demanding them in volume. It developed early leech farming operations, attempting to breed medicinal leeches in controlled environments to stabilize supply. It lobbied for regulations protecting leech habitats in some regions, recognizing that the wild population could not sustain indefinite extraction. Notice what is not on this list. Nobody proposed improving conditions for the human collectors. Nobody tracked what years of collection work did to the women doing it and designed a response to that problem. Nobody asked whether the price per leech should reflect the actual human cost of collection rather than simply the minimum the market would bear. The institution mobilized considerable energy and creativity to protect its supply of leeches. It mobilized nothing toward the people the supply depended on. This was not oversight, it was prioritization. The leech was a medical instrument with documented therapeutic value. The collector was a commodity input, replaceable as long as poverty in rural areas reliably produced women who needed money more than they feared cold water and blood loss. When the leech supply ran short, the problem was visible, measurable, and urgent. When the collector's body gave out, it was simply her problem to manage. The system never registered it as a problem at all. We don't use medicinal leeches the same way anymore. The humoral theory that made bloodletting the dominant medical treatment for centuries was finally discredited in the latter half of the 19th century, replaced by germ theory and the beginnings of modern medicine. Leech use collapsed almost overnight once the underlying theory fell apart, taking the demand that had driven the collection trade with it. Today, medicinal leeches are still used in specific surgical contexts, microsurgery and tissue reattachment in particular, where their anticoagulant properties are genuinely useful. But the scale is nothing like what it was, and the supply is managed through certified medical leech farms with regulated conditions. No one wades into marshes to attract them onto their bare legs anymore. But the pattern underneath the leech collector's story did not disappear when the leeches became unnecessary. Think about every industry that has ever depended on a human body absorbing a risk that the industry itself was not willing to regulate, compensate fairly for, or even formally acknowledge as a cost of doing business. The body that breathes in chemicals in an unventilated factory. The hands that harvest crops in heat without water breaks. The workers in industries where the occupational health data simply was not collected because collecting it might have made the practice more expensive. The leech collector's story looks historical because the specific tool is obsolete. But the logic that produced her situation has never required leeches to function. It only requires a demand, a supply of people with limited options, and a sufficient gap between the people making the decisions and the people absorbing the consequences. That gap has proven remarkably durable across centuries and industries and technologies. The marsh has been drained. The structure underneath it is still there. Here is what I want to know. Is there an industry you use today where you suspect the people at the bottom are absorbing something the rest of the chain would rather not measure? Tell me in the comments. This is just one trade that bled quietly until the demand disappeared. You already know where to find the rest.